it's impossible to tell everyone's story. Marxist history is should be the history of the fight against all oppression, not just the history of labor, which most people, when they talk, they mean white labor or European labor or something like that. Not just Black history, not just Native history, but I actually got myself into trouble by trying to tell everyone's story. So um, there's no way to do any of that justice in a talk, no matter how long it would be. So I apologize in advance for any deficiencies. This will be deficient, but I am going to try and give a sense of what I think a real Marxist history of the American Revolution should look like. I won't succeed, but hopefully this can be a start. So, so Marxist Mythbusters. Not my choice for a title, but it got me thinking. Is I was an English teacher, so it got me thinking: is this a Marxist busting myths, or am I busting Marxist myths? So I decided I'll do both. Because myths about the American Revolution abound. You can open any history textbook or walk through any bookstore or library or say the word Hamilton within 50 paces of a theater in the United States, and you're instantly bombarded with hagiographies of the founding fathers, so-called, and their seemingly limitless wisdom. Um, for the right wing, July 4th is considered second only to the birth of Jesus in world historical importance, where they believe that a handful of geniuses were inspired directly by God to create the world's perfect country. They are literal about that these days. Trump was not the first con artist to hawk Bibles with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution included as God's epilogues, but he is the latest and the most recently successful. Among liberals, the story is actually virtually the same, with the caveat that the founding fathers were not quite perfect, that we just had to be patient until all those slight defects, like, genocidal racism and misogyny, were eventually corrected, so that whatever imperfections they may have had in the past, at least now we're the closest we've ever been. Now, on the left, and by that I don't mean liberal, but on the left, there has been two dominant approaches. And these two approaches are diametrically opposed, but also find their origin in the work of the Stalinist Communist Party or its several offshoots. The first takes a bastardized version of Marxism and says, just like communism was established in Russia by revolutionaries like Stalin and Lenin, leading a working class revolution against capitalism, capitalism was established in the US by revolutionaries like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams against feudalism. Herbert Aptheker and Philip Foner were both proponents of this idea. Sometimes these people did argue that this revolution was unfinished and was only finished and only complete after Lincoln single-handedly abolished slavery in the Second American Revolution during the Civil War. And so they see the American Revolution and the Civil War as kind of a part one and part two of the bourgeois revolution. The second approach on the left is the mirror opposite of this one, advanced by CP adjacent folks like Jay Sakai in the book Settlers, published in 81, I believe, or more recently by Gerald Horne in the Counter-Revolution of 1776, and even Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. Hers is better than the other two, but still has this general thesis that there was no real American Revolution at all. The War for Independence was essentially a coup by colonial elites who manipulated everybody else. They did this because the British Empire wanted to tax them, to forbid them from stealing more Native American land, and of course the British monarchy wanted to free all the slaves. So this ends up being the idea that the British Empire was the progressive side and the American Revolution was the reactionary side. The problem with all of these takes is that they all agree on the essentials. They agree on the standard story of the revolution, that it was essentially organized, made, designed, and completed by the founding fathers, that they were the ones who ran the whole show from the beginning to end. The whole country was their project, and everything that comes from it is their project as well. That probably won't surprise anybody that I disagree fundamentally with all of these, and I didn't set my alarm. There you go. Uh, and that I think the basic premise is wrong, and that even brilliant Marxists make fundamental errors when they try and make sense of the revolution on these terms. A few years ago, the brilliant Marxist, and I'm serious about this, he's a brilliant Marxist named Neil Davidson, wrote a brilliant book. It's a brilliant book um, titled "How Revolutionary Were the Bourgeois Revolutions." I highly recommend everyone read this book. Um, it's I learned so much by reading it. My only regret is that I need to find the time to read it a few more times. Um, However, I think it suffers from the same flaw I just mentioned. It takes the idea that this revolution was created and done by the founding fathers, and that their ideas and their intentions were the main factor in this revolution. Um, that question that the book titled is "How Revolutionary Were the Bourgeois Revolutions?" I think a better question to ask might be how bourgeois were the bourgeois revolutions? And what I hope to say to illustrate tonight is that the answer I don't think is very much. They actually had a very minor role in the whole crisis. They took advantage of it, of course, but their ideas and their interests were not the primary factors. So this isn't going to be a straightforward talk. There's not nearly enough time for that. But I did want to give a sense of this system. Lots of people just start right away with the Stamp Act crisis and all this without going into what this society was like that had crept up in this colonial system. Um, in your high school history, you may have heard the term mercantilism, but that doesn't really explain much. It was basically a colonial system designed to create and accumulate as much wealth as possible for the home country. Damn the consequences. They were making this up as they went along. For Britain, this meant creating colonies that would ship raw materials to Britain to be manufactured into finished goods and then shipped out to the colonies and other places for sale. This supercharged the small guild-based urban manufacturing sector, but there's a problem because you need workers to do this. If you keep shipping them overseas to produce raw material, you keep shipping these workers overseas to produce raw materials, then you have to pay the remaining workers more. So you need to constantly find more workers. You need to push them off the land. You need to go other places to find them and force them to work for you. Um, so you need to find these workers where they can't grow their own food and they're dependent on you. But then you also need to artificially suppress the ability of these colonies to manufacture things. You don't want them to compete with you. So things will cost more. So you have to find some way to pay these workers in the colonies more. What Britain eventually settled on was the idea that they wouldn't pay these wages. They would move into slave catching and invent a new slave system. And this is one of the first myths I want to talk about from the Marxist side is that um, slavery is often talked about as an ancient institution, a pre-capitalist institution. This has always struck me as kind of strange. Marxists often will say that capitalists want to pay wages. Really? My bosses would love to not pay wages at all. Um, Marxists are sometimes okay with the idea that the um, the patriarchal family had to be reinvented by capitalism, and into the modern nuclear family. But they don't apply the same logic to any other kinds of institutions. And I think that logic does apply to slavery. That New World slavery was a recreated institution, a capitalist institution, to maximize exploitation. So that, in my view, and I think this is the Marxist view, is that slavery, the history of slavery is the history of the proletariat. Okay. And the history of slave rebellions is the history of the first proletarian rebellions against capitalism, or some of the first. Um, all right. So sorry, sidebar there. Um, And then for those that it did pay, it didn't pay them necessarily good wages, but with a promise that they would get land. Where would they get this land? Stolen from Native Americans. Okay, so what we have is this transoceanic system that combines the most advanced manufacturing technology with artificially suppressed technology, with a system that relies on pushing people off the land while also giving them more land, which belongs to other people who don't want to be pushed off their land. Um, it needs people to stay and be workers, but it also needs people who don't want to be workers and want to go live on other people's land. If this sounds like a crazy, chaotic system, it is. If it sounds like it was like a recipe for constant rebellions, it was. If it also sounds like I'm pushing people to think about the phrase combined and uneven development, I think that also applies to this colonial system. This idea that like different social forms are coming together in a cauldron that will clash and create the conditions for change. Um, And in fact, I went to school a stone's throw from colonial Williamsburg, and visitors were constantly bombarded with the image of happy colonial laborers, farmers, blacksmiths, sailors, etc. But once you start digging, there's barely a handful of years that go by without an uprising or a rebellion or a riot of some sort or other. Um, so I want to talk about some of that today to set the stage for what happens and why what happens in the American Revolution happens. Most standard histories start with the aftermath of the French and Indian War, Britain's attempts to recoup some of the costs of the war. Um, Historians will say actually the colonial subjects weren't taxed all that much, and imply that the colonials were kind of spoiled. But again, the colonials knew what kind of system we were in. They knew they couldn't manufacture their own stuff. There were jokes even among the white colonials. The white wasn't really invented yet. That in order to reshoe a horse, you had to send the horse back to London. Um, so they knew they were paying artificially high prices, and taxing them on top of that would throw most of them into absolute poverty. And many of them were already in absolute poverty. Um, as a result, as part of the system, there were people subverting the system. A good number of colonials actually made their living through smuggling, including some of the wealthier ones, like John Hancock. Um, so, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act really pissed off a lot of workers and led to major conflicts. Mainstream historians will often have a hard time explaining why people were so upset. And they frame it as 150 years of calm, happy blacksmiths and sailors, and all of a sudden people are upset that their quote rights as Englishmen were being violated. And it always seems way out of proportion. But if you understand what came before, it does make sense. So let's rewind a little bit. Not Boston 1765, but New York 1741. And I decided I did want to spend some time doing this, so this will actually take up a bit of time, but this is, 30 plus years before the Revolution. So in New York, 1741, waterfront taverns were filled with semi-employed vagabonds, conscripts, impressed sailors, which means they didn't want to be sailors, but they were forced at gunpoint onto the ships. Um, Slaves working the docks. Some were born in the colonies, but not necessarily New York. Others were born in England or Ireland or West Africa or Madagascar or Cuba. They were white, and I'll get to that in a second, what that meant, and Black and Hispanic and Native American. Many of them gathered in John Hewson's tavern, who was a shoemaker, a cobbler from Yonkers. And his tavern right on the water, in one of the worst parts of New York City, was known to be a place where low or unpaid workers, not just slaves, but impressed sailors, indentured servants, apprentices, all were unpaid workers, could get a drink on credit and could fence the odd stolen item to the proprietor or his wife or daughter to settle a debt. One of these people was a woman from Ireland named Margaret Carey, Peg Carey, who moved to New York from the fisheries of Newfoundland. She meets and falls in love with a West African soldier, a Coromantee soldier, probably a Sante, um, who's who had been captured and sold into slavery on the west coast of Africa. Um, and his owner called him Caesar, but he called himself John Gwynn. These wharf workers from various different backgrounds organized themselves into various clubs and gangs for solidarity, mutual aid, protection, camaraderie. Peg and John Gwynn start talking with John Hewson, the owner of the tavern, and people from other gangs. These gangs had names like the Fly Boys or the Long Bridge Company, um, and others like a group of Irish conscripts who worked at the local Fort George, which is where the seat of government was, who all despised the British Empire. Then a new group arrives. This new group were speaking Spanish. These were free blacks from Havana, a free black community in Havana, who were captured at sea and then sold into slavery in New York. They were literate. They were well trained. They were part of the Spanish garrison there. Um, they sued in New York for their freedom, but the white magistrate said, "No, you're slaves." So they all started talking and resolved to attack Fort George and burn the fort and the entire city to the ground for their freedom. And what they meant by their freedom was not just legal freedom, right? Some of these people were legally free, the wage workers. What they meant by freedom was the ability to have a good life. This is where the word freedom actually comes from. It comes from freedom dues, um, and the idea that way back when a serf who was freed would be given land of their own. This then translated to indentured servants in America. When an indentured servant was up with their term of service was up, they were given their freedom dues, which was land to farm as their own. At one of the last meetings, a white conspirator named David Johnson, he stood up and toasted, swearing, quote, to burn the town and kill as many white people as he could. He didn't see himself as white. The category of white was still in flux at the time. Particularly in New York and on the dock milieu, white people, that term was reserved for people who didn't work in the sun. It was reserved for rich people. So when he said he wanted to kill as many white people as possible, he meant rich people. Um, some reminisced about the slave revolt of 1712. Some of these conspirators had witnessed that just 30 years before. Some discussed the uprising in French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Some mentioned escaping to Madagascar, where the last of the Caribbean pirates had fled about a decade prior. Um, some remembered the golden age of piracy, where the first republic in the New World was set up in the Bahamas. It was the Pirate Republic. Um, Others mentioned the Maroon War in Jamaica, which had just ended with a partial victory of the Maroons over the British soldiers of the British Army. The plot to burn Fort George and strike out for freedom is carefully laid out and involves dozens of people at least, if not hundreds, organizing a coordinated attack on British authority. Unfortunately, someone gets impatient and starts setting the fires early. The uprising is thus uncoordinated, partially underway, and the rebels are quickly captured, tried, and executed. However, for weeks afterwards, fires were burning in both New York, New Jersey, and Long Island in solidarity. That's how widespread the conspiracy was. One of the few to escape was Hewson's daughter, Sarah, who ran away with John Gwynn and Peg Carey's baby and disappeared from the history books. The bodies of John Hewson and John Gwynn were hung up, chained, and caged on the wharf as a warning to anybody else daring to oppose British authority. But then something happened. And this story is if anybody's interested, in The Many-Headed Hydra by Marcus Rediker, which I think is one of the best books on the era of the American Revolution, although its scope is much wider. The bodies of John Hewson and John Gwynn were hung up as a spectacle, but something happened to the bodies. Hewson was what we call white. His corpse began to rot and turn black. John Gwynn's body started to turn ashy white. For weeks, People came from all over to witness this, what they called miracle of the black man becoming white and the white man becoming black, seeming to symbolize for a lot of people the interracial solidarity of the whole episode. New York authorities eventually realized that this was even more dangerous and removed the bodies and buried them quickly uh, out of fear of inspiring any further interracial solidarity. So why do I mention this? Well, this uprising was in turn referenced a few years later when a British ship docked and the sailors of this vessel deserted en masse. The officers, they needed they needed sailors, they needed a crew. So they swept the docks and attempted to impress anyone they found into service on the ships. A huge riot erupted and the ship was forced to flee with only a minimal crew. 1 year later, in 1747, a similar incident occurred in Boston with gangs of port workers, sailors, servants, slaves, and apprentices chasing away the British naval officers and soldiers. This uprising was so big that a young, downwardly mobile son of a prosperous barley malter named Samuel Adams was inspired to start a newspaper devoted to the idea of people protecting their liberties against what he called British tyranny. This, in turn, was in people's minds when, after the French and Indian War, Britain instituted several new taxes, including the Stamp Act. And this is where the traditional story starts. But even then, the traditional story is all about the people like Sam Adams, who had some measure of respectability. When in fact, at the time, people called it the Stamp Act riots. So, and here I'm going to get a little disjointed because I'm going back to my original notes. So in Boston, like in New York earlier, the lower classes in Boston were organized into gangs. Particularly, there was the North End gang and the South End gang. And every November, they would engage in a huge citywide brawl on November 5th in honor of Guy Fawkes's attempted demolition of Parliament, attempt to explode Parliament. It was tolerated because it was ostensibly a celebration that he was caught and Parliament wasn't really exploded, but really it was a kind of a massive festival of the oppressed, to borrow a phrase. And rich people hid in their homes, and boys, which interesting linguistic thing. Boy still carried its older meaning of term of servant. So when the people comment about boys roaming around, sometimes they were referring to children, and sometimes they were referring to servants, which could mean slaves or apprentices or any number of other classes of people. But in particular, it was younger children who would go around on Guy Fawkes Day and throw stones at rich people's mansions at their windows, and ask for a penny for Guy Fawkes Day. And if the rich people didn't give them money, they would break all their windows. This is the background to what was going on in when the Stamp Act was about to take effect. And these gangs become politicized. The leader of the South End gang was a shoemaker named Ebenezer McIntosh. And these types of people are the people I want people to think about when they think about the American Revolution, not the bewigged slave owners and merchants, but the people who are actually taking on the might of the British Empire head on. The Instead of engaging in a kind of fist fight with each other with the North End gang and the South End gang, instead the authorities were absolutely shocked and terrified when the gangs don't fight each other. Instead, they go to the warehouse of the person who was going to be the Stamp Act or the stamp collector, Andrew Oliver, and the warehouse that he was going to use to house the paper, and they burn the warehouse to the ground. Then they march over to the lieutenant governor's house, Andrew Oliver, and they burn his house to the ground. They go in and ransack it, steal everything, and um, he barely escapes. He was actually in a house next door, and they just didn't search that house. Um, a similar riot takes place in New York City, and in New York City, they again attack Fort George, the fort that was going to be burned in the plot in 1741. Um, and they burn several buildings to the ground, including the governor's. Uh, in both Boston and New York, they make effigies of the governors, parade them around, hang them from trees, and set them on fire and behead them. Um, this is what is going on in the run up to the American Revolution. The the slave owners and rich merchants are nowhere to be found. Um, this type of thing continues. The British government realizes they can't uh, maintain the Stamp Act, so they repeal it all. But they try again with different things. 1770, just 5 years later, they try something else. The Tea Act. One myth, oh, this was a tax on tea. No, 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 no. This was not a tax on tea. This was a tax cut on tea. Um, what had happened was that the British East India Company, which I believe every member of Parliament held stock in the British East India Company. And its stock in 1769, 1770 plummeted just shy of 100%. Um, and this obviously was a crisis for not just British capitalism, but for the people in Parliament in particular. The Tea Act, what it did is it lowered the tax on tea with the idea that the colonials will stop smuggling illegal tea. And then we will dump all this tea held by the British East India Company for cheap in the colonies, and then we'll recoup some of our costs this way. Um, and previously, ships had to go to London and then go to the colonies. So they said they can go directly. So it'll be cheaper because of reduced transport costs. It'll be cheaper because we're having the tax. We're lowering the tax, and this will bail out the the company. Um, People saw through it. They knew what this was, right? Even though it was a tax cut, even though it was uh, uh, reducing regulations. What did they do? They refused to let the British East India Company um, unload their tea in Boston Harbor. They also refused to let the ships leave. The governor wanted the tea unloaded, but couldn't do it because who was in control of the wharf? The workers, right? Um, and this reminds me at some other point, the when the mobs were marching through the street, the governor demanded that the militia be called out, and then he was told by one of his advisors, "The militia is out. They're in the streets. They're just not on your side." Um, so the what happens with the Tea Act or with the tea in Boston is that eventually um, uh, the the dock workers, the port workers, storm the ship and dump all the tea overboard. Um, I had the number. I can't find it. What this was? It was 10,000 pounds. It was estimated to be 10,000 pounds worth. If I remember correctly, that was something on the order of $3.5 million worth of private property. So when you see the right wing say, Tea Party wearing their silly tricorn hats and all this stuff, right? They are lying about what the Tea Party was, right? If you see these racist psychopaths, if you saw them in the Obama years, you'd be forgiven for thinking, wow, anything they like, we want nothing to do with. But in fact, the right wing does what they always do with popular history. They They turn it into their own by lying about it, by defanging it, by co-opting it. The ruling class steals our history in the same way they steal our labor. Um, so the right these things are going on, right? The King Street riots, right? The Boston Massacre, right? 1770. This was uh, a riot against soldiers led by dock workers, right? The most famous victim of the Boston Massacre was, of course, Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was not a wealthy slave owner. In fact, he was half black, half Native American. He was he was free, like he had freed himself and had lived as a fugitive on the door on the wharfs. Um, he was known to be a rabble rouser, and that's why he was in the vanguard of the people telling the soldiers to get lost. Um, this was the milieu that created the environment which the revolution became inevitable. Um, and the what the ruling class, what the ruling elites of the colonies did was decide to ride that wave. But they didn't decide this until very, very late. Who was the defender of the soldiers who murdered the people in the Boston Massacre? The founding father, John Adams. And he said that the soldiers were justified because they were defending themselves justifiably against a rabble of, and where's that phrase? It's a beautiful phrase. I'll try and do it from memory, but a saucy band of mulattoes, um, uh, or a band of mulattoes, saucy boys, and jack tars, meaning slaves, servants, and sailors, right? Or and Irish Teagues, Irish Teague he threw in there, so he got all of it. Um, that's the founding father versus the people who are making the revolution, fighting the British. Um, the revolution really breaks out in it does break out in I'll wrap up. Does break out in Massachusetts, and what happens finally in Massachusetts is it's no longer a rebellion just focused on the proletariat, the nascent proletariat on the in the cities and the ports, but it affects the entire colony. In 1774, every single county, the militias mobilize and march to their local courthouses. And court means like royal court. This is where the administration is, not just where judges were. These are the local executive authorities. And they kick out uh, the royal officials and elect their own representatives, except in Boston, where there's a massive military garrison by this point. And so what you have is finally the fusion of both the rural, low, lower level, smaller farmers, and the urban working classes. And then in this situation, the the ruling elites have to make a decision. Are we going to support or oppose this? And till the very end, they are debating right up until 1776, a year and a half after literally the Boston militia are fighting the British. They're still trying to decide whether or not they should try for independence. Um, and even then, some of them have to be overthrown. Several colonial militias, especially most notably Philadelphia or Pennsylvania's, need to be overthrown. This is where Tom Paine comes in. Tom Paine is portrayed by some of the CP type people as the most radical wing of the American Revolution, but in fact he's pretty deferential to the elites, and uh, uh, Philip Hunter outright lies at one point about his role in the overthrow of the Pennsylvania legislature, saying that he led the revolution and successfully won the election. In fact, because Paine had put forward some elite, wealthy people as an alternative slate to the royalists, people decided, well, we may as well stick with the royalists, and they lost that. So it was left to the rabble of Philadelphia, the dock workers and the artisans in Philadelphia, to just go ahead and overthrow the Pennsylvania legislature. Without Pennsylvania, the southern colonies never would have joined. And in fact, to illustrate that, in the one last little point about what was going on in 1774, right as this was all happening, the Second Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress goes to meet, and Georgia doesn't send its delegate. Why? Because it decided, well, there's this uprising of Native Americans, and we need British guns to protect us from that. But we'll join you once this uprising of Native Americans is dealt with. That was 1774, the same time that Massachusetts farmers were leading their uprising. The Georgia elite was siding with British, but they're counted as some of the founding fathers, right? So I know I'm out of time here, so I'll just kind of wrap up by saying that what happens I'm not interested in the story of the Revolutionary War and all these battles. Those are not really relevant to me. Except I will say that when the elites finally do join, they send up George Washington to lead the army in Boston. And what is his first act? His first act is to dismiss any Negroes, Native Americans, or mulattoes from the colonial militia. Right? What then happens is that the elites, because of their priorities, they weaken the revolution. Right? There were many Native Americans early on that wanted to join because they were fighting against the British. But when they realized that George Washington, who was representative, who had plenty of land claims west of the Appalachians, that he was going to recruit the most vicious of the settlers, and rather than Native Americans, then what Native American choices became clear. So the elites actually weaken the revolution rather than leading it. They debilitate the revolution at every step. They demobilize the local militias, and it's only through the militias in the North fighting independently of the Continental Army that they're able to win. Now, last thing, where does the revolution end? Right, Yorktown, right in Virginia. What happens here, I think, shows what happened, what the legacy really is, and what happens afterwards. We know that post-revolution, we have the North and the South divide, right, between slave states and free states. Except this isn't quite true. The North had slavery too. Well, what happens? Through the course of the revolution, it and the people fighting in the North, that's where slavery is abolished, where the revolution was successful, right? In the South, the British win, right? In the Southern campaign, the British win. Why? Well, for instance, when the British general lands in Savannah, they have no idea where they're going, but they land and they come across some slaves and say, if you want freedom, help us figure out where everything is. And so local slave populations help the British. This is why the British Empire rampages through the South successfully, because there is no popular support for the elites down in the Southern colonies. In the North, it's more of a popular uprising that forces these things to be dealt with. And so um, when the revolution and when the War for Independence ends in Virginia, right in the middle, that's where the dividing line between the free North and the slave South eventually comes from. Um, Having said that, I just want to end by saying that this is not a simple thing for a lot of people to get their heads around. And I'll just end by saying something slightly different. Um, I work for UPS. My bosses are bloodthirsty, maniacal, greedy bastards. About one of us a week dies on the job. It is a horrible place to work for. However, I will often recommend that people uh, look for jobs at UPS. Why? Because we have rights. Who, why do we have these rights? Because of the union that I'm in, because workers have fought for those rights. These two things are true. A company is run by psychopaths, bloodthirsty, greedy psychopaths, but it's also a place where we have rights. That kind of complicated attitude is the same kind of complicated attitude I think we should have towards things like that are called bourgeois rights, which really are not bourgeois rights. These are rights won by the ordinary working people, despite the leadership of the revolution, rather than because of them.